to see if we do anything.
Hello. Hello.
There
Hello.
you go.
Da 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 da.
Now, if you talk to him some more.
Talk.
What's that? Sure.
I make an announcement right quick for everybody too. We've got 3 of those children left that need stuff for Christmas. There's only 3 left. Does anybody want any one of them?
Right. Look at theirs. You're so good, Eric. I was gonna take them back. He said, give me those.
Y'all,
Just give them both.
you want both of them? Praise the Lord.
Lori said she'll take them.
She had 3 left. She said, I'm gonna take them back to school. I'll give you them. Y'all-
Well, looks like it's time, I think. Glad you're here tonight. I hope everybody's doing well. Any announcements or anything we need to know before we get started tonight? Pardon me?
Okay. Wow. There you go. Well, I hope you had time to read a little bit this week. First book of Samuel. Actually, somebody said some years ago that most people that were into the Word and studied the Word and taught the Word talked about 1st and 2nd Samuel being 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Kings being 3rd and 4th Kings. So they said all 4 books often were referred to together because it was the history of the kings. So I don't know how they decided what to call it, because we know the history is there, and I hope we can learn that some of these lessons that will help us in our life. Even when you get as old as Eric and me, we can still learn, can't we? We're going to learn in Alaska together, maybe. Are we? Debbie's going to let you go? Ah, now we've got the real story. She says it's dark up there all the time now. You got to have a headlight. Okay, well, I hope you're learning and enjoying from our time together. I'm trying to listen to the Lord and how He wants me to present it to you. I know it's not an in-depth study, but I hope it's a good basic study to help you understand more about the Word and the things that's going on. Understand the periods and what God's doing in people's lives. I got several things I want to do, but let's do this first. Let's say, did anybody have any questions this week? I want to give you that opportunity. If anybody had any questions about what we were reading in the first 10 or 11 chapters of the book of 1 Samuel. Any questions? Any comments about it? Okay.
Obedient sons.
Yeah. They were. They weren't just disobedient, they were evil, weren't they? Yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk a little more about that. That's for sure. Yeah. Anybody else? Any comments that you could think of? want to do 2 or 3 things before we start. Number one, I want you to turn to Acts with me, Acts chapter 9. And if you don't want to, that's fine. I'm going to read it anyway. Acts chapter 9. I want to point out something to you, and I want to just talk about it just a minute. Most of the comments that we hear about the Apostle Paul talk about how great a man he was, an unusual man, maybe the most important man in the Bible. I mean, we hear lots of comments, but one comment that I thought about, I think during maybe either Eric's or Doug's message maybe not long ago, a couple of weeks or so, I think one of the most telling things, and the reason I'm starting here is because we're going to see it again tonight in what we're studying, but if you go to verse 15 and 16 of chapter 9, it's something that very rarely is pointed out, and this is what the Lord said. The Lord said unto him, he's talking about Paul, Saul of Tarsus, go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. He's mine. I've appointed him. I've anointed him. For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. We often think, and I don't want to say it's always true, but we often think about the life of a Christian being, so much easier. And sometimes while we're living everyday life, we say, Lord, I don't deserve this. I'm trying to be in your will. I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to do that. Lord, why are you putting this upon me, I'll share this little story. I hadn't even planned on doing it, but my cousin, same age as me, we graduated together in high school, and she had a son, I think he was about 50 years old, and hadn't seen him in a while, but I got the call last week that he had passed away. And so I went by to visit with her and take some food, and she's been in church. I don't think she's real, active, but she's been in church, and I think she's made a profession of faith. But we were talking about it and discussing it, and one of the things she said, I was talking about the solace of the Lord and the comfort of the Holy Spirit, and she said, I'm really not there. She said, I'm really struggling with it. I don't understand why people have to suffer for 3 years with cancer the way he's suffered. I don't understand how God can take my only son. I don't understand. And the reason I share that with you is because life, as we know it every day, is generally a struggle. Now, to get the idea that life's not a struggle every day, I think is a false misconception. I'm not saying we shouldn't have peace. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be in God's arms and hands and trusting Him for every word. But as far as no suffering and as far as no problems and no trouble, the curse of this life is upon every one of us. I tried to console her, and I don't know that I did a very good job, but I think Doug and I are going to go back and try to. But it's just an example of what we face just about every day. When I visited with Amy and Tank, or Amy, Tank was gone, but we talked about the struggles that we go through, not understanding why. Now, the reason I bring that up is because as we start into Samuel, I want to look at the struggles of life as they were. God's always at work. Now, I want you to get this. If you don't camp on nothing else, if we're a child of God, God is working in your and my life. We don't know it necessarily. We don't understand it necessarily. But God's always at work in our life. And that's what we're going to find tonight. I just wanted to bring that to your attention because I think that's something to camp out on. Number one is, yes, Lord, I know that this life is not great. I know that your contentment and peace, and I know what you've done for me should be a part of me. But I understand, just as hopefully Paul did, and I'm sure Paul understood this more and more. He said, I must show him how great things he must suffer for me. And when we're called and we're in ministry to the Lord, sometimes things happen we don't understand. And yet, what do we have to do? We have to come to a point, don't we? We have to, in ourselves, to have that peace, we've got to understand that God has us in His hand. And we throw Romans 8:28 in there and says, all things that's happening to me has to be filtered through Him. And it's for His good, His glory, and my service. Well, as we come to God is going to allow a new thing to happen here. We're coming down to the end of the Judges. We're talking about Eli, and we're talking about a young man by the name of Samuel. And these men were chosen men. And we're going to talk about that. But what I want you to understand, and what I want to camp out on just a minute, is the conditions that existed as God allowed this new thing to come about. Because what we're going to do is see the transition from the period of the judges into the period of the kings. And we're going to see how that happens. God's allowing it to happen. God's doing some things to work in these people's lives. But if you remember the very last verse, I'm going to read it for you, the very last verse in Judges 21, which is before we get to Samuel. He said, in those days, you remember it, there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. I submit to you that when we do what we think is right in our own eyes and we don't compare it to the truth of God's Word, we get in trouble. And that's exactly where we find these people. Because what we find as we enter into this first part of Samuel, the last part of the Judges, is we find that there was some very, very bad things going on. We find Eli. He's been the judge over Israel for some time. We find that he has two sons that are evil to the core. In fact, we'll look at a verse or two and just describes in very crude terms how evil they really are and really were. So we find that every man was doing what was right in his own eyes. We find that the Philistines had come to power and had their thumb up on the children of Israel. Why? Well, we've talked about it over and over. Israel said, no, we don't believe God. We don't think we ought to chase them all out and destroy them. We're just going to allow them. We can't overcome them. So we find that the Philistines have their hand up on these people. We find that the tabernacle is at Shiloh. And so we find that there is a ritual going on because in the first part of Samuel, we see them going up annually. It says, and I thought about it, I don't know for sure, but it was to one of their 3 high feast days, I'm sure, because they had the Passover and they had the annual Day of Atonement. And so one of those, and we'll refer to it, but we find that they've still got a ritual, and there are some people that still hold to God being God. They truly believe that. But yet we find that there is so much evil and things going on, and it must have been a terrible time. And I'll point out, let's see. Let me just read 2 or 3 verses for you. I looked at them. In verse 12 of chapter 2, now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial, and that means they were evil, sons of the devil, I guess, if you really want to put it in it. And they knew not the Lord. Now they had been appointed by Eli to minister at the tabernacle. And yet we find that they were so evil that they were even having intercourse with the women that came to the tabernacle. They were ostracizing the people. They were just evil. And it says the people became very disgusted with that. Let's see what I wrote down, verse 17 of that same chapter. The sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred. Men, Israel, abhorred the offering of the Lord. But Samuel ministered before the Lord being a child. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then in verse 22, and then I just wanted to show you. Eli was old and heard all that his son did unto Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So I want you to understand that people were making decisions every day. People were living their life every day. And it was a tough time because of the sin and the rebellion that existed there in Israel at this time. We're going to see a little bit more of it. So, to see how God was working, I want to tell you a little story. You can go back and look at it, but here's the story. There was a man that lived in Ramah. He had 2 wives. Now we know, first of all, that God said don't do that, and they still insisted on doing it, but he had 2 wives. One's name was Hannah. One was, I have to look it back and see it was Peninnah, yeah, whatever. So what we find is we've got a family here. This man goes up annually to the tabernacle, and we see him doing that. And he loved Hannah, and he gave her special favor. That's not to say he didn't love the other one. The other one had a house full of kids, had children by him. And Hannah did not have any children. Now here's the way life goes. I don't know what sin, caused this, but anyway, the story is that Hannah was very, very sad, hurt. Everything about her life was backwards. She couldn't understand why she had no children. She wanted a son. And so every day when they got up in their little tent or house or whatever they had, they'd go to the breakfast table. And so here's Hannah, and she was at the end of her rope. And her sister wife, not sister, but her other wife, would look at her and say, "You must have done something bad in your life not to have children. Why would God be torturing you like this unless you'd done something?" I mean, I'm sort of paraphrasing, I think, what was going on. And so day in and day out, this wife would terrorize her. She had no confidence. She didn't understand anything that was going on. She was at the end of her rope. She knew that her husband loved her because he showed her special favor. And so she wept. She was in bitterness. Can you imagine what it would have been like to live in that situation? We got one that's got a whole family of children just like I want. I can't have one. I don't understand why God won't give me one. I don't know. It can't be my husband's fault because they've got kids, so it must be my fault. Can you imagine all the things that's going on in her life? Now, you also got to remember the culture. It was so important in those days. It was so important in those days in that culture for a woman to have at least a man-child. Carry on the name, birthright, all the things that had to do with that. And so, I don't know what all went. But anyway, it says that they went up to the temple for to take their annual sacrifice to this annual celebration. And so, while they're there, she is in such bitterness. She's in such anguish. And she's sitting over there. And she's there, and it says that she was weeping and she was in bitterness and her mouth was moving. Tears were coming down. And here's Eli. He's an old man by now. And in his judgmental state, he walks over to her and he says, honey, you're going to have to quit coming to the tabernacle drunk. That's basically what he did. And she said to him, oh no, you don't understand. My soul is vexed. I have no children. I don't understand why. I want one. He said, he promised her this. He said, by next year, or maybe not by next year, but in the near future, God's going to give you a child. Now, if you go back and you look in that chapter, it says, let me just point it out to you. Verse 5, but unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. You see, sometimes it's hard for us to understand what the Lord's doing in our life. And by anybody's account, we would say, Lord, why would you be doing that to me? I'm your child, and I trust you. But isn't that what we do? So, we come down. Verse 17, Eli said, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition. Well, we know that she made a vow. She said, Lord, I'm at the end of my rope, and I don't know what else to do. But she prayed, and she said, all I want you to do is to give me a man-child, and I'll promise you this. I will give him back to you for his life. A razor will never come upon his head. That means, if you think about it, I mean, you know, we look back in the 60s and everybody had hair down to here, and one of my preacher friends yesterday, he's got hair down to, you know, we look at it and we say, well, is that right or wrong? And well, if you'd have been back then and you'd looked at old Samuel may have had a ponytail, I don't know. I'm not sure he ever had his hair cut. But to God, all he was looking at was the heart. He wasn't looking at the hair. And so God, that's lessons for us. We've got to be careful how we judge people. We've got to be careful how we judge people because we don't know what God's doing, first of all, in their life, and we don't know their heart. And so there's a lot of people that are hurting. A lot of people in bitterness and weeping, and a lot of people in a lot of different situations. Anyway, it says that she conceived and she had this child. There's probably not a happier woman in the world. She had this young man. She named him Samuel. And so her husband said, it's time to go up at the annual feast again. And she said, well, I haven't weaned this young'un yet. And I've promised the Lord that when I wean him, I'm going to take him up and leave him at the tabernacle. So I'm going to stay here and I'm going to raise him. So he's a young man. Elkanah comes back. And the next time that we know of, she takes him up. And so we see in verse 21 of chapter 2, Hannah conceived. And we find that in verse 27, there came a man of God unto Eli. And this man of God God sends this man to warn Eli of his sin. In verse 29, he said, you're kicking at my sacrifice and my offering, and I've commanded in my habitation, and you honor your sons above me, Eli. Verse 31, the days will come that I'll cut off thine arm and the arm of thy father's house, and there shall not be an old man in thy house. So God sends Eli a warning. And I want you to think about that because it says in verse 34, and this shall be a sign to thee that shall come upon thy two sons, on Hophni and Phinehas, and one day they shall die, both of them, and I will raise me up a faithful priest. God's at work. God's doing something. It may seem like he's not. And so he promises. And so what happens? Well, we find that those two sons were just about as vile as Eli's two sons. And so she takes Samuel up, takes some provisions, And she leaves this young man. I don't know how old he might have been. Wasn't very old. She said she's weaned him. I don't know what the tradition was and how many days. You may know, Eric. I don't know. I don't know how old they might have been. But he was a young man, and so he calls Samuel calls Eli his father. And so Samuel is called by the Lord as he ministers under Eli at the tabernacle. Now, something occurred to me. Here's this young man. He's grown up in a house, and I don't know what his mother might have been like. I think his father was probably a semi-godly man, since every year he went up to the tabernacle. But can you imagine what it might have been like as a young man? And here you've got two brothers that are evil as anybody can be. And you're growing up watching their lives. And here's Eli saying, son, this is the way you need to live. This is what you need to do. This is how you need to act. This is how you minister to God. And Samuel says, yes, Father, I understand, but what about them two guys? That would be sort of a difficult thing, wouldn't it? To be raised under a man that you think is supposed to be a godly man like Eli the priest, and yet the two sons of him are a terrible example. Well, God sent him a warning, and so when God called Samuel, we know that story, how he called him during the night. He went to Eli and he said, Eli, what do you want? He said, I didn't call you. He said, go back to sleep, boy. He heard him again, and he went back and he said, Eli, what do you want? And he said, I didn't call you. He said, but when you go back this time and somebody calls you, say, yes, Lord, what do you want? That's what he did. Well, the Lord talked with him there. He gave him some promises, told him what the future was sort of going to look like. So next day or so, maybe that morning, Eli says, Samuel, tell me about your story. What happened? Samuel says, well, I really don't want to tell you, because see, Samuel had done heard the bad news again. Now Eli's already had the story told to him once by another man. God sent another messenger, but this young man that he loved, and he loved, they both loved each other, I think. He finally said, and Eli says, don't lie to me. Tell me the truth, even if it hurts. And he said, well, here's what God said. He said, you're going to die, you and your sons, all the same day. Well, we know that happened. If we look at chapter 4, Let me go back and jump back to chapter 3 just a minute. Verse 13. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knoweth, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. You see, as parents, there's always judgment in our life when we rebel against God. Now, Eli might have been a pretty good man, and he probably was at a certain time, but it says, because you didn't restrain your sons. It doesn't say Eli did the things his son did, but he said, because you didn't restrain your sons, you're going to have to suffer the consequences. So they come down. At verse 18, Samuel told him everything. Verse 20, all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew and had heard and was reported that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord. So this is maybe the first prophet that the Lord has sent, a beginning of the prophets. The Lord appeared again in Shiloh, and the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Somehow God spoke to Samuel. He became a wise young man. The people realized that he was being raised by God for an important thing, a chosen thing. The word of Samuel came to all Israel in chapter 4, verse 1. Israel went out against the Philistines. Now, I don't know that I can explain the whole story, but Samuel says, I want to talk to you, Israel. And so they decided after the discussion, the Lord already revealed to Samuel the things he wanted to know. So all of Israel said, we're tired of being under these Philistines. We're tired of this mess. And so they said, we're going to take care of it. They go out. And so in verse 2, Israel was smitten before the Philistines. The bad thing about that is two terrible things happened. Thousands of the Israelites were killed. The Philistines stole, captured the ark. And that day, the two sons of Eli died in battle. And the messenger went back and told Eli. And I think the same probably response that had been shared with Eli by Samuel when he stuttered and stammered and says, I really don't want to tell you the truth, probably took place there because he had to give him the bad news. He said, how did it go? And he stuttered and stammered around and he said, your two sons are dead. And I imagine before he fell off that bench, because it says he was a really big man. In his old age, he had put on a lot of weight. And before he fell off and broke his neck and killed himself, I suspect running through his mind, he said, the Lord told me so. And there's one thing about it, when the Lord predicts something, and we're going to see it in this lesson tonight, it always comes true. It never fails. That's the reason that I'm such a believer in this Word and in the God of Israel, because I can't find anything He's ever promised that has failed. I can't name one thing. So anyway, the story of the ark is sort of interesting. If you remember, they took the ark, and I think it was, let's see, I wrote down where it was. They took it to Ashdod. They took it to Ashdod. Philistines were afraid of it to begin with, but they took it and they said, we're going to put it in the house of Dagon, our God, and all of the gods. And so the story was that they put him in, and they went the next morning, and Dagon was turned over, and they said, what in the world? Nobody's been in here. And they couldn't understand it. So they stood him back up, and the next morning they fell over again. He didn't just fall over, of course. God did it. And so not only did that happen, not only did they understand it, not only were they afraid, God sent this terrible plague. Now, I don't know what it is. I read several things, and it was some kind of a disease, and it has to do with the private parts and all that stuff, but it was a terrible thing. It was a plague. It was a terrible disease. And he sent it upon all those people in that town. And they said, we can't tolerate this. Let's get rid of that doggone thing. Let's send it somewhere else. Let's let somebody else keep this thing for a while. I can imagine what all was going on, because they were all under the plague, and they were miserable. And their God had been defaced. And so they decided, they said, hey, call old Mortimer over in Gath and get him and his crew to come over here. And so they did, and say that. They said, you got to take this thing over to your little town over there, because we've had enough of it. So they take it over to Gath, and same thing happened. The plague hit them, and they suffered miserably. And after a little bit, they said, we can't tolerate this. They were smart enough to know that the ark, something was going on with it. So they called and they said over to Ekron. That was one of the other towns, and they said they made a long-distance phone call, and they lured them over, and they sent it over to them, and same thing happened. They all came down with the plague. So they decided after 7 months that they had had enough. They said, there's something about this. We know the history of this ark. We know the history of Israel. And they recounted, and they said, these are the people that came up out of Egypt. These are the people that came to Sinai. These are the people God has brought into this land. They said, get rid of this thing. So it's a funny thing. They built a new cart. 7 months. They've had this thing 7 months, and they built a new cart. They put it on there along with it. the idiots. They made, I think what they made was they made some little gold idols.
They made a golden hemorrhoid.
They put them in they put them in the ark. What a desecration! It's a wonder God hadn't melted them, thrown them out.
Oh, you know God had to be laughing. I mean, I think he was.
Some of these things are, yeah. Well, you just got to use your imagination to try to think about how ignorant can you be. When you see the actual proof, it's like going up with Elijah on the mountain and seeing God do what he did. And not saying, man, something big's going on here. You know, they had to. Anyway, they didn't send anybody with the 2 cows and the cart. They put the ark on it, and they said, now here's the way we're going to know if this thing's going to work. If this cart goes in this direction, we'll know it's not of God. But if it goes in this direction and goes up to this town, we'll know it's of God. So they turned the cows loose and the cart loose, and it says they made a beeline. No driver, just the cart and the cows and the mice and the whatever they are. So here they go. And they make a beeline. They go straight up to Beth Shemesh. I think is the way you would say that. I don't know why the Israelites had to name these cities these names that you can't even pronounce. Well, anyway, I don't understand how God always does things. But what we find if we follow that story is we see that when they got up there, the people were happy. They were glad. They rejoiced that the ark was come home. But they did a stupid thing. They went against what God had directed them. They said the ark is a holy, holy, holy thing. And these are the things you can and the things you can't do. And what did they do? Their curiosity killed the cat. They opened the ark and looked in. You just say, well, that doesn't seem like a big deal. I mean, just anybody's curiosity would kill him. But let me tell you, folks, I don't care what it is, if it's little, big, or indifferent, when God says something, we better listen. Because there's a consequence if we don't. How many people did he kill? How many? 50,000 Israelites. What verse is that? 6:19. Let's read that. 6:19. And he smote the men of Bethshemesh because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. Even he smote of the people 50,010. You see, if we don't learn anything else, we need to learn that God is holy and righteous and just. Not only that, he's merciful and he's forgiving and he's everything that's good. But when we rebel, when we don't listen, when we do things in the wrong way, he'll judge us, and he did that day. One of these days I'm going to add up all the people that died from the time they left Egypt up till maybe after David and Solomon. And I'm going to see how many million people were killed because of rebellion and disobedience. Unbelievable number. I don't know if anybody's ever done that or not, Eric, but it's a bunch. It's a bunch.
Because a lot of times when they're mentioned in the scriptures like that, 50,000 men, they don't talk about the women and children that died. They always classified that as mixed. So it could have been 100-some thousand people.
Yeah.
We don't know.
What's the lessons of all this, though? What are the lessons that we, in our heart, I mean, what do we learn from this? Obedience. 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 Obedience, folks. And we can't get it through our old thick skull, can we? Well, what we find is after this, and we come to chapter 7, we find that Israel repented because Samuel gathered them together and said, listen, folks, it's time we get serious. It's time we get serious. And so it says they repented. Let me read a couple of verses. Verse 3, Samuel spake unto all the house of Israel, saying, if you do return unto the Lord with all your hearts, put away the strange gods from among you, and prepare your hearts, and serve him only, he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. Then the children of Israel did put away Balaam, Ashtaroth, and served the Lord only. And so we find that they go out against the Philistines again. Verse 8, and the children of Israel said, cease not to cry unto the Lord our God for us, that he will save us out of the hand of the Philistines. Verse 9, Samuel cried unto the Lord, and the Lord heard him. Verse 10, but the Lord thundered, and great thunder on that day upon the Philistines, and discomfited them, and they were smitten. And the men of Israel went out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and smote them. I often wondered about that song, Here I Set My Ebenezer. I said, what in the world is an Ebenezer? Somebody wrote that song, and right here's where it came from. Samuel took a stone, set it between Mizpah and Shin, and called the name of it Ebenezer, saying, Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. I set up the stone. It's a memorial. It's a place where God helped us. We asked him, we repented, and he did it. The Philistines were subdued. And so we find in verse 15, Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. I've got about 5 minutes to tell you about Saul. Now, I'll finish with the story of the anointing of Saul in chapters 8, 9, 10, 11. We see God at work again. We see the people continually saying, we want a king. We want a king. We're not like any of these nations around us. They've all got kings. We want a king. Samuel got mad. He said, what in the world is wrong with you all? Are you all stupid? Are you crazy? Have you not learned anything? Samuel goes to the Lord and he starts crying on his knees. He said, Lord, this bunch of ignoramuses, now I'm paraphrasing, you know I am. I don't understand them. And the Lord said to Samuel, he said, Samuel, give them what they're asking for. Samuel says, what? He said, yeah, let's give them what they're asking for. I'm going to let them. Sometimes God lets us do things even when he knows they're not going to turn out very good. And that's exactly what he did with them, because in the end, I think he thought they might learn a lesson. So what'd they do? He said, this is the way we're going to do it, Samuel. I'm going to tell you everything that's going to happen. And so we find that Saul went out looking for some lost animals. And as he went, he was asking along the way, have you seen these? Have you seen these? And everybody said, no, we hadn't seen them. And he comes to this one place and he says, I'm looking for these lost animals. And they said, hey, old Samuel is a prophet, a seer of the Lord. He lives right over there. Go over there and he'll tell you exactly where they are. He said, huh? They said, yeah. So he goes over and he talks to the seer, the prophet. And God has already talked to the seer, the prophet, the day before. And he said, this is what's going to happen. So to make a long story short, God told Samuel everything he needed to do, exactly how it was going to happen. And it happened exactly like it did. God said we're going to give him a king. Now, there's a few important things there. Verse 7 of chapter 8, he said, the Lord said to Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people, into what they say unto thee, for they have not rejected you, Samuel, they hadn't rejected you. They've rejected me. So he said, I want you to go and tell them what's going to happen. So in verse 11 on down there of that chapter, he says, here's what's going to happen to you. You gather together again. And I think they respected him to some extent. But he said, this is what a king's going to do to you. This is what God told me to tell you. He's going to take your land. He's going to take your kids. He's going to take everything you've got. He's going to build himself up. He's going to make soldiers. He's going to, all the things. He's going to tax you to death. And he gave them the whole list. And they said, we don't care. We're going to do it anyway. So God let them do it, didn't he? We go on over to chapter 9. And remember I told you the last time about that little town over there, Gibeah? And you remember they were the Benjamites? And remember that they all got killed except the 600 young men? And they found them wives so that the tribe of Benjamin wouldn't be gone? Guess where Saul came from? Right out of that tribe and right out of that little town. That's where God called him from. And so Saul, he was a pretty fella. He was handsome. He was tall. He was everything a woman could want. And his heart wasn't too bad. The Spirit of God came upon him. He promised to do this. Samuel sat down with him and he said, Saul, let me give you the real facts. God said, here's the situation. Here's what you're to do. Here's how you're to do it. Here's the things that are important. Here's what you better pay attention to. Gave him all the instructions. He said, now I want you to go up and wait for me 7 days. And I'll be there and we're going to do this thing. So Saul goes up, and the Ammonites, another one of the thorn in their flesh, they've raised up, and so they said, we're going to do something here. So Saul said, I'm not waiting on Samuel. I think I need to do this. And his heart was turned. He did exactly the opposite of what he was supposed to do. And so in verse 19 of chapter 10, Samuel called the people together, and in verse 19, and ye have this day rejected your God. Verse 20, Samuel caused all the tribes of Israel to come near, the tribe of Benjamin, and we move right over, and in verse 22 through 27, we see the story. They inquired of God in verse 22, and this young man that God had called, whenever it come time, verse 22 I thought was so interesting. Therefore they inquired of the Lord further, if the man should yet come hither. And the Lord answered, behold, he's hiding behind a bale of hay. Reminds you of Gideon, don't it? Remember what Gideon said? Lord, I'm not worthy. I'm not strong. I can't do it. It reminds me of me. Reminds me of you. Reminds me of a human. We say, God, I know you're saying I can, but I can't. He was scared to death. Well, Samuel said, verse 24, the Lord has chosen, and they said, God save the king. Let's see. I wanted to find one or two verses here. Well, they don't come to mind right away. Anyway, the Lord said about Saul, it changed his heart. An evil spirit came upon him. And from that point onward, Saul was not a very godly man. And we're going to look at his life, his relationship to King David, and all the things that happened. I think the takeaway from all this that I wanted you to see tonight, and over, the Bible says it, so why shouldn't we? Over and over, God says, I'm a God of righteousness, and I'm a God of provision. I'm a God of mercy. I'm a God of everything you need and everything you want. All I ask is when I define what I tell you is right and to do, all I want you to do is be obedient. But if you're not, you will suffer the consequences. Now, that applies to me and you. It applies to us and our children. It applies to us and our church. It applies to us and our community. It applies especially to each one of us individually, because God is working in our lives. Whatever He's doing to you this week, Mitchell, and Shane, and Tara, Lori, whatever He's doing to you, He's right in the middle of it. So we ought to get up every morning and say, God, here I am. Help me. Show me. Help me to be bold. You know, he preached about being bold and courageous. So I hope this week as we go, Junior, whatever we're doing, me and you're in a different class than a lot of these people in here. They're going about life, and me and you're out in the workshop playing around. But it still applies for our life. That's the reason I said at the piano cry this morning. I love our president at CBM for 36 years. He's been faithful. He was called. He's been a servant. And I think about what God's done with me, and I think about what He can do to every one of us. Yeah, you retired, but He ain't done with you. The happiest, most productive days of our life is in our future. I want us to understand that. Every one of us. Amanda, I know you're going through tough times at school, but God's right dead in the middle of it. Amen. Doug, I know you have frustrations, and I'm proud of what you're doing, but it ain't easy. That's the reason I read what he said to the Apostle Paul. I must show him the things he must suffer for me. Because this life is a war. And every day of Eli's life, every day of Samuel's life was a struggle. Because they had to get up and make decisions today and tomorrow and the next day. And if we don't learn anything else other than these things out of here, He gave us story after story after story to learn by. And it makes me so happy and blessed to be able to come up here. And I know Eric's the same way. I know Doug's the same way. I know anybody that teaches is when God speaks to us and says, I have this message for my people, and it's important. Thank you all for giving me this privilege.